Right, friends, we're going to go ahead and get started because we have a lot of ground to cover this evening. And I want to welcome you all to our fourth session of Growing Up ACEs, Stories and Opportunities to Support Children and Families. My name is Jessica Canton, and I will be the presenter for this evening's session. You have Dave Luke, who will be here to assist with any technical issues that you might have. I'm hoping that it'll just flow very easily. I do see some familiar faces, and so some of you who have attended these prior workshops are probably used to the format at this point. Tonight's session is going to be a bit less scientific and terms-based and more rooted in our stories. So I want to just kind of give that space in the beginning to make sure that you're taking care of yourself during the session. Some of the content that you hear may be triggering in different ways. And if you need to back out of the session at any point during the presentation, please do that. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. Following this, right before we wrap up, we'll go over the logistics around certificates and that sort of thing. So bear with me while I share my screen. And I believe Dave has uploaded the presentation to, I'm still getting used to Keynote, although I do like it a ton better. So I want to just get us reconnected. Let me just see what I have this. Oh, this is old. I just want to get us reconnected with adverse childhood experiences and some of the research I've been doing as of late. So we're gonna watch a short video that is a resource that we'll be working with tonight called Number Story.
Let's start here. The story of your number is the story of your ACE history, a score used to measure the number of adverse childhood experiences that happened to you before the age of 18. ACEs fall into three categories: abuse, neglect, and household challenges, and are so common that 2/3 of us have at least one. A landmark study found the higher the number, the more likely one can experience negative health effects like heart disease, diabetes, depression, stroke, and asthma. The number is connected to an increased probability of lots of bad stuff. But you are not a number. The number is simply an entry point to your own personal story. Where it leads is up to you. ACEs are not your fault. They happen to us, but they don't need to define us. No person with a 2 is the same as another person with a 2. Each 7 is different from every other 7. Each of us is a unique story, and we each have the power to determine how our own story turns out. Explore the story of your number. Understand how it impacts the children in your life, and take control of where your story leads.
So I have become really interested in stories probably almost, I want to say, 10 plus years ago. And it started when I was working for the Division for Children, Youth, and Families. And I was at a conference and got an opportunity to attend a presentation where there was a gentleman talking about the power of sharing stories. And then through my research over the past few years, delving deeper into researchers like Brene Brown and others, really started to think about the humanity in sharing your story. And so throughout the evening, you can pop your questions into the chat, and I will take pause at opportunities for reflection so we can share with one another. We just got, hold on, someone was, one second. It's not always easy to navigate these. Oh, I think I'm gonna just trust that if Dave needs anything, he'll unmute himself, I should say.
Absolutely. Just let me know if you need anything.
Okay. All right, let's see where we're at. So I want to ground us in this concept of storytelling as we've known it to be is, often there are many different kinds of stories. There are fiction stories, life stories, autobiographies. And when I began to share my own story as a survivor of childhood trauma, I noticed that some people were very open, and some people really struggled with that story, hearing it. And that's a lot of what we're going to unpack tonight. Like, how do we become good story listeners? And we'll get practice through that from listening to some stories I'm going to share from other survivors. And we're going to talk about the humanity of it all. So let's start our night with, what if we were willing to acknowledge our hurt and pain, and in doing so did not diminish the hurt and pain of others? We could change the world. And that is really so true. So we're going to talk about the phenomenon of sympathy versus empathy, the difference, and why the latter is the more important. So I always like to start off giving you all an overview of everything we're going to be chatting about. We're going to learn our 3 C's this evening. We're going to share our stories in the sense of, I'm not going to ask any of you to share your story. I'm going to give you opportunities to think about how you could share your story. We're going to listen to some stories, and we're going to talk about healing and growth through experiences and some of the limitations that shame and trauma put onto us. And as I mentioned, and I'll say it again in case some new folks have joined us, just make sure that you're taking care of yourself tonight. Oftentimes when we're talking about trauma and shame and adverse childhood experiences, our own life experiences can pop up for us, and just make sure that you're taking the time you need to process that. So Brene Brown defines shame as this intensely painful feeling or experience of believing that we are flawed and therefore unworthy of love and belonging. I am bad, I am a mess. The focus is on self and not behavior, with the result that we feel alone. Shame is never known to lead us towards positive change. So in other words, like in our culture, shame gets a bad rap. And when things are uncomfortable, oftentimes we shy away from them. It's a human instinct. We're all born with it. And what she suggests is that if we own our shame story, and we'll learn what that is about this evening, then it has no way to grow within us. It has no way to grow within a community. When we own shame stories, when we accept that humans have experiences, have traumas, have flaws, if you will, then we can begin to see the humanity in others. And that also becomes a part of just overall life experience at varying levels for every individual person. I'm going to let her explain this concept to you all.
So first of all, let's just talk about shame. You studied it.
I did.
Not many people have studied it.
No, in fact, I wanted to study it, and a lot of people said, no, don't study it, don't study it. And then I was kind of a rebel rouser, a little hellraiser. And so I thought, oh no, then I'm going to study it definitely if I shouldn't study it. And I go to the stats at the library at our college, and the first article I pull says the decision to study shame has been the death of many academic careers.
Oh my goodness.
I was like, student loans, death of the career. I'm like, oh my God.
Wow.
Yeah. You know why?
Why?
Nobody wants to talk about it.
Yes.
We have a visceral reaction to the word shame.
So you say that if you're like on an airplane and somebody says, oh, what do you do? And you say, I study shame, people, they literally turn the other way.
I have answers based on whether I want to chat or not.
Yes. And the answer.
I study courage. Oh yeah. I study shame. Oh, these angry birds are fantastic, aren't they? That's it. Wrap it up.
Yeah.
The 1, 2, 3 is about shame. We all have it. It's the most human, primitive emotion that we experience.
How do you define it?
The intensely painful feeling that we are unworthy of love and belonging.
And
the
does it
devil.
occur after a particular incident, or does it occur over, many life experiences?
Both.
Both.
It could happen in an instant. There are specific memories that we can recall that can bring up shame for us. But there are also very insidious, quiet messages that we just marinate in over a lifetime.
This is what I've always known about and tried to get across to people, and don't think I was successful at it really, in the 25 years of the Oprah show. The thing about abuse, and particularly sexual abuse, most people think it's about the sex. It's really about the shame that occurs after the sex, and it's keeping it the secret, and we're only as liberated as our secrets. And the secret creates the shame, and you end up feeling like you're a bad person. And it's the shame that damages your life. The actual act itself, people can get over that, but it's the shame that you carry with it.
There is no question in my mind.
No
that's
question
truth.
about that.
That's just truth.
That's
That's
just
like God truth.
Yeah.
I think shame is deadly. And I think we are swimming.
There'll be stuff in the chat,
Do
man.
people recognize it
No.
though? I think people don't
So
recognize it.
people have one or two reactions when I say shame. They
Yeah.
say, I don't know what you're talking about, but that has
In the chat, it'll be
Yeah.
download.
I know exactly what you're talking about, and I'm not talking about that. But here's the bottom line with shame.
Mhm.
The less you talk about it, the more you got it. Shame needs three things to grow exponentially in our lives: secrecy, silence, and judgment.
Yeah,
So you put shame in a petri dish
yeah.
and you douse it with a little secrecy, a little silence, and a little judgment. It grows exponentially. It will creep into every corner and crevice of your life.
And shape all of your
Shape everything.
shape everything, the way you think, the way
Yeah.
you think about yourself, the way you think about other people, the way you
Everything.
interact with other people, what you do, the choices you make, who you marry, all of it.
You put the same amount of shame in a petri dish and you douse it with empathy.
Mhm.
You've created an environment that is hostile to shame.
Wow.
Shame cannot survive being spoken. It cannot survive empathy. So if I call you, if something really shaming happens to me,
And you talk about it.
and I call you and I say, oh God, Oprah, it's Brene, you're not gonna believe what happened. I'm in such deep shame. And you say, what's going on? And I tell you, and you express empathy,
Yes.
shame can't survive it. Shame depends on me buying in to the belief that I'm alone.
Mm.
I have a good friend, Robert Hilliker, who I work with, and he's a therapist, and he always says, hey, keep the shadow up here because it can only take you down from behind.
Whoa, that's good.
Yeah.
Let's see. So I guess let me bring us all back for a minute. Because I thought it was going to be oh, people are saying they can't hear you well. Okay, I will try to make it louder. Is that better? Use your emojis, thumbs up, thumbs down. Okay, I apologize for that. You're all on high now. So when we think about the word shame, if you wish to do so, put in the chat, what are some things that come up immediately when you hear that word? I'm seeing judgment, I'm seeing trauma. Fear, turning inward, curling up into myself, embarrassment, isolation, loneliness. Yeah, and these are all things that can be combated when we're able to talk to them, when we're able to talk about them. And I believe I've mentioned this before, but I keep saying it because I think it's important for folks to understand that we are the only creatures on the planet that hold on to our shame. and hold on to our trauma. Every living creature releases it. They'll get rid of it. You'll see it like this physical process they go through. And so the way that we can physically process through that is through sharing of stories, is through listening to stories with empathy. And we're going to talk tonight about what that looks like. And that intersection with adverse childhood experiences is that the reason why ACEs are so impactful is that developmental piece, because ACEs occurring between that birth to 8 years old phase and older, but I'm going to focus on birth to 8 for the purpose of what I want to chat about. We narrow that down even further, birth to 5. Most critical brain development is happening during that time. That's when we're really getting a sense of the world and relationships and experiences. And if most of our relationships and our experiences are negative or do not promote connection, then we start to begin to turn inward. We start to feel lonely. We start to feel sad. We still start to feel embarrassed. We start to fear people that we think should be taking care of us and looking out for us. And that really is because we're wired for connection from birth. We are wired to receive relationships and collect them and hold them dear. So let's go on. Thank you for those of you that shared that space with us. So Brene Brown in her book, The Gifts of Imperfection, talks about these 3 C's: courage, compassion, and connection. And I want to spend a little bit of time tonight focused on those. I like groupings like this that really sort of give words to something that we often aren't able to express ourselves. And so courage is, in storytelling and sharing your story, is taking the risk of being vulnerable and disappointed. It's also fostering kindness when you may not feel like you're equipped to hear the story that you're listening to. But it's also empowering others to be courageous. When you tell your story, inevitably 2 things happen. And I've seen this in real time. As I mentioned before, I have told my story to others. It took me a long time to formulate my story, longer in my life than I would have liked or hoped for. And when I started telling it, I had 2 sets of people. I had people that would come up to me and thank me for sharing their story, and then they would share theirs with me, which is an exchange. A lot of productivity can happen there. And then I had people saying, you should probably never tell that story again. And it's because my trauma, my shame impacted them in a way that was difficult. It was difficult for them to receive that information. And so I important.
I don't understand this. If you sign up for a thing, why is everybody bringing their kids and husbands in?
I don't know.
Leanne, just put yourself on mute. Thank you. So the second is compassion. Compassion allows us to draw from our experiences, right? It cultivates equality. If I'm being compassionate towards you, then I'm understanding and I'm being empathetic. And compassion can be scary when you aren't great at setting boundaries, because it can overrun you. Because sometimes if you're not careful, you can put yourself second and not take care of yourself. But compassion cannot exist without acceptance. And so it's one of the more important C's that we'll discuss this evening. And then the last C is connection. And this is the energy that exists between people when they feel seen, heard, and valued, when they give and receive without judgment, and when they derive sustenance and strength from the relationship. And so connection is what we're all wired for, and ACEs are what disrupts connection. So the intersection of that creates this environment that makes it challenging to feel seen and valued and heard, which are things that you often need to be able to tell your story and explain what, what happened, or things that you need to be able to listen to someone else's story. It's a survival mechanism. So what is a shame story? Your history of why you developed the shame you have, a collection of experiences, incidents, and memories, the trauma you experienced, and something you carry with you throughout your lifespan. And we all have it in varying degrees. As the video mentioned in the beginning, every number story is different and acts in different ways. The statistics show that 4 out of 5 people have an ACEs score of 3 to 4 or higher. And most of the entire population at least has one ACE. So let's hear our first story of the evening.
We all have a number story.
Part 1, feel. Listen, our relationship with numbers is complicated. We're taught to worry about our weight, our age, income, zip code, follower counts. But does any of that even matter? How is an ACE score any different? Adversity we faced as children is scored. That number is a part of you. That number recognizes what you've overcome. It doesn't define you. And like those other numbers, it doesn't tell your whole story. That's not to say that your experiences should be dismissed, but we have to allow ourselves to feel what we've experienced. We have to feel the hurt before we can feel the love. If you want to cry, cry. If you want to yell, then yell. If you want to laugh, then laugh at the insanity of it all. Follow it with a deep breath and move on to part 2. Deal. With a solid, cleansing breath in your lungs, it's time to find your path to your best self. Carry the knowledge you've earned and gather the tools you need to thrive. Whether that be a phone to call a therapist or text your best friend, a playlist of songs that effortlessly express what you're thinking, a journal to write the words your tongue isn't ready to say out loud yet. Sometimes I get a little lost in stories captured in film and television. Tears form around my eyes when a protagonist says exactly how I'm feeling better than I can describe it to you. It's scary sometimes to think you're broken somehow. You have to put in the work to heal, but no one said you have to do it alone. Part 3, heal. It isn't always easy to learn how to stand back up after a fall. Some days will feel better than others. Some you'll feel stronger. Make a habit out of using your tools. Find the people and things that bring you joy. Our experiences should not limit us to the care we deserve. Being strong enough to share them out loud is what lifts others up. We're like muscles, torn apart for a bit, just to mend and grow stronger than before. And no matter how our society is built to break us down, remember, matter cannot be destroyed.
Learn more about your story at numberstory.org.
So when I first came upon the ACEs study, I was in my mid-30s. I'm 44 now. And, at that time, I was still a little surprised that because I was well into my career in human services in New Hampshire. At that part of my career was focused on early childhood education. And I was really surprised that I lived that long on the planet in my field without hearing about the ACEs study. The ACEs study is fairly old. I mean, I believe at this point, it's probably almost 30, well, maybe 25, 30 years old. And yet it hasn't been until like the recent past 5 to 6 years that there's really been this movement for us to understand how ACEs are impacting our communities, understand how ACEs are impacting our schools and our programs and the ways that we do work, and how adults can thrive and grow. And a lot of that has to do with our culture of minimizing things that are uncomfortable or disruptive to what we consider to be our happiness. So I thought it was important for us to discuss like how ACEs disrupt the 3 C's that we just talked about. Through dismissal and denial, right? That's just a coping mechanism that a lot of us have. Most oftentimes children and adults who've had higher ACE scores have had limited to no model for healthy boundaries in their lives. They've navigated much of their life, what I like to call in survival or trauma response. So they're always on hyper alert, that waiting for the next bad thing to happen to them, or being vigilant about being able to keep themselves safe and secure. ACEs will also create an opportunity to have limited exposure to healthy connections and relationships. And this is probably one of the more critical factors, because what that allows for is an opportunity for generational trauma to reoccur. My number story, and I love that new term, is around an 8, on the higher end of the ACEs score spectrum. There are currently 10 ACEs, although they have begun to expand out into other areas, which I'm really happy to see. And, you know, that ACEs score really set me about on a trajectory of, you know, exposure to many things that disrupted my life. And you're like, well, you know, I mean, seemingly everything turned out okay, right? I'm successful, I'm a mom, I'm a wife, but it's not without consequence. There are residual impacts. And so what I have found, and why I'm so like passionate about this, is that being able to talk about it, being able to have a story to it, in whatever way felt good to me, and really helped me to begin to heal. Because I was able to draw on the strength of other people that were listening, and they were empathizing, and they were sharing their own journey. And then I began, when I came to the YW, to do work in the community with children and adults and youth who've experienced trauma, experienced violence. I think that was even a more healing layer for me, because I was able to really create in real time, you know, opportunities to create a more trauma-informed community where we do recognize the impact that adverse childhood experiences have on children. And the other thing that I referenced earlier is that ACEs impact brain development. You know, we're wired for that connection. And when those connections aren't happening the way they should, it can have longer term effects. Although positive experiences later on can recreate those positive connections. So it's not as a sense of like, this is how it happens and this is how it's going to go for the rest of your life. It's more like, this is how it happens, and how that community of support surrounds that person it's happening to is really going to set about to see how resilient they are to the things that they were exposed to. Some story disruptors, right? Some things that prevent us from being able to listen to a story or share a story is really shame. We talked about that. It's our shame, it's other folks' shame, the uncomfortableness of that. And it's fear that what we might be hearing, and I used to hear this a lot from teachers that really struggled with, well, I don't want to hear something that I might not be able to fix or support. And really all that's required to listen to a story is empathy, is validation. Even when you have to dig a little bit deep, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And then this resistance to vulnerability. That's what kept me in shame for a long time. Probably, I want to say, you know, more again than I really wanted to, is that I felt like if I could say that I came out of my childhood unscathed, that it didn't have any lasting impacts on me, that I was a successful person, that I was a fairly good mom, that I was not the person I was, my childhood did not define me, then I could say that I was strong and brave, because that's what our culture supports, right? That, you know, you're strong and brave when you don't. But what happens in that is you lose the vulnerability. You lose your opportunity to be authentic. You lose your opportunity to heal. And unknowingly, you're still on that course, experiencing those ACEs, but it's also impacting the relationships you have now. So let's stop and do a little pause for reflection. And the chat seemed to work pretty well last time. So I guess, how would it feel, or how does it feel to share your stories with others? Or how do you feel when someone shares their story with you? And if you want to unmute yourself and talk, you can do that, or you can type it in the chat box. We'll do it both ways this time. Amanda says empowered. Wendy shares, I feel excited, like the world is opening and up and becoming more real, more authentic. I like that what Laurel said was privileged that someone would share something so personal. That's a really good point to make, that our stories are not meant for everyone to hear. It's a gift we're giving someone. So we should really think about who we're sharing our stories with and why we're sharing the story. Ali says vulnerable, and Christina talks about healing. Kira says gratitude for the opportunity of learning and connection. And Shemeka talks about, I would feel I have to be more connected with the person and I would need to trust them. And Kira chats again about empathy. And I think those are all really real and authentic things to consider. And so I'm not suggesting that you go into like Market Basket or Walmart and just start stopping people in the aisles and sharing your story. No, those stories are incredibly sacred, and you should really think about who you're sharing them with. And if you're a professional working in the field, and I have to stop myself from doing this all the time, even with my team, is, you know, we're going to talk about like this kind of like comparison thing, right? That sometimes we do because we're trying to be relatable, but unknowingly, like we're stealing sort of the stage of this person sharing with us. So we have to be, and I've also in the past used stories as a tool to try to connect with somebody who wasn't open to connection. And it ended up making me feel worse. And that's why we need to be mindful of it. Maria talks about sharing my own story can be intimidating and scary. I appreciate when others feel comfortable and trust to share their story with me. Agreed. Zainab, when someone is telling me their story, I feel special, not only because I know they're being the most vulnerable with me, but also believe in me to understand and trust me enough to open up. Yeah, it can feel really good. Think about how good you feel when someone is trying to connect with you, right? And that is probably because many of you that are sharing this gratitude have done some of that work of healing already. And so it's really about the stories is like almost like a self-evaluation piece of thinking about like, when am I ready to hear this? And so we also sometimes talk about before sharing something with someone, asking them, hey, are you in a place right now that I can share something with you that might be a little upsetting? And so because everybody receives information differently. And with children, they're not always going to be able to do that, right? And with children, their stories are going to seem a little bit different than ours. in adults and how we set the stage and how we chat about them. Children's stories will often be very intermittent, meaning that they will come at the most, what we adults would like to think is most inopportune times. And they will say them as readily and as easily as if like they're asking you for crayons. And this can be really unsettling because we as adults know enough to share our stories, maybe depending on who we are, in safer spaces. And so we need to create those opportunities for children to feel validated and heard, even if for us it feels uncomfortable in the moment when they're sharing them. So let's continue. So one of the things I love about The Gifts of Imperfection is she talks a lot about developing shame resilience and story claiming. And so what the 3 things to know, and this was really validating for me to hear, because after such a long period of really dismissing and denying experiences, you sometimes can feel very isolated and alone, like many of you were discussing in the chat. And so 3 things to know. We all have it. We all have shame, some degree. I don't care if your shame is, there's no like comparison contest. Oh, your shame is better than my shame, or oh, your shame is worse than my shame. No, everybody has it. Everyone has it. We're all afraid to talk about it. These are not things that make us feel good to talk about, right? But one thing we do need to realize is the less we talk about it, the more control it has over us. And there's power in that. There's power in reclaiming your ability to tell your story. You can take back some of that control. And, as a survivor, I still have relationships with, the people that I was in an abusive relationship with. But the difference is now is that because I've spoken out and I've talked about what happened to me and I'm further down the road in healing, I don't feel like healing is ever at an arrival point. I feel like you're constantly in a state of doing your work. The work just gets easier and better. I was able to gain a lot of grounding and being more in control in those situations. And it was not easy. It was not easy because everything also tells sometimes we can be very all or nothing. Well, you shouldn't be in a relationship with this person if they're doing this to you, or you should cut this person out if they're not filling up your cup. And those are ultimatums that don't often always transfer into humanity. And those are often ultimatums that folks who have ACEs, higher ACE scores, will often employ in their day-to-day relationships and work because it's a survival mechanism. If I can set these ultimatums, then I can control who comes into my life and who I engage with. But sometimes that backfires because it can come across in ways that make it really challenging to communicate with them, understand where they're coming from. And navigating what I call trauma responses are not easy. They're not easy at all. And it can be very damaging to forming relationships and sustaining them. Feel it. Okay. I thought I heard someone. Leanne, I agree. It is hard to listen to a story when you just realized you yourself have your own ACEs. Absolutely true. I appreciate you bringing that up because it's not easy. It's not easy. And it's also, when you begin to like open up your world in this sense, it will extend itself to like movies and TV shows and situations. And that's why I talked a little bit in the beginning about making sure you're taking care of yourselves in terms of your triggers. So I'm gonna switch us over into another story. And this one was comes from the Your Number Story website again. This one's a little bit more personal than the last story we heard.
We all have a number story, and I had the pleasure of mentoring this young woman, Cheryl, who is in our youth foundation, Inspiring Children, where we help people heal from trauma. This is her story and a beautiful poem she wrote.
Dear trauma, I remember you, but I am not you. I remember crying by the window, wondering why you wouldn't come home. The beer cans at my feet in the passenger seat. Doors slamming, things crashing, voices running rampant. The pain in your eyes and cries fed into all my lies. I remember guilt, fear, sadness, and resentment. How those feelings used to dictate my every action. How those feelings consumed me until I no longer could see. Worthless, pointless, purposeless, my life seemed. And my escapes were still not ridding me of my pain. Freedom just felt so far away. I thought suicide was the only way. But little did I know that after that almost fatal day, my life would change in an extraordinary way. That day in the hospital, I can't quite explain. Something was sparked inside my soul. I knew I had it in me to grow. Realized these thoughts in my head all weren't true, that I had the power to choose, to let go, love, and push through. I stopped running away, and in stillness I stayed. Breathing in and out, I finally could see my thoughts were not me. All I had to do was simply breathe. With each next breath, I was often put to the test. All my pain would rise inside of me, and it would get difficult to breathe. In the beginning, I cried and cried and cried, but I carried on and tried and tried and tried. Coming back to my breath during times of distress, when everything in me wanted to hate, I refused to take the bait. In those moments, I'd say I healed the most because I let love be my host. And now 6 years later, here I am today, free of all that old trauma and pain. Now it lives as an old memory. I actually think of it quite fondly. It gave me the chance to find the deepest kind of love so that I could rise above and figure out who I am by not living under my trauma's hand.
Learn more about yours at numberstory.org, and to learn some exercises that Cheryl used to overcome her trauma and anxiety, you can go to jewelneverbroken.com.
So I found that story, her story, to be so powerful. And that was a lot. So I just want to make sure that if there's someone that wanted to comment in the chat, we could share that. Yeah, no, I agree, Lorinda. I was like, when I found these stories in advance of talking with you all this evening, I was so happy because they were just so beautiful and poignant. And I was like, this is going to hopefully be very impactful. And I would encourage you to check out the Number Story website. I haven't even begun to scratch the surface in it, and it seems as if they have a lot of great information. So much like the young woman that was just speaking with us, you know, she was talking about how this used to consume her and her responses. And, you know, a lot of that is fueled by shame, right? And by fear and all of the things that accompany me, that depression and anxiety. And there's things we tell ourselves. If we tell people the truth, we are afraid we won't be liked or loved, right? The shame is only reserved for those who've been through terrible trauma. I know that was when I used to tell myself all the time. I'm like, well, you know, I know people that have been through worse than me. And I really want to stress that comparison is a thief of joy, and it truly is on so many levels, and not just something as deep as what we're chatting about right now, but you know, we're all individually human. And I think the other one is we will disappoint others. You know, I still get that old saboteur kind of in my brain creeping up at times when I when I speak out publicly, particularly on social media about my own story or being a survivor, because I know that in my audience, those audiences are people that I have been in those kind of relationships with, and I always think about, well, how would it feel for them to receive that and hear that? And then the last one is, this will define who I am. And I think these myths really kind of, and I say myths of shame, meaning like, these are things we tell ourselves to allow ourselves to stay in shame, you know, and that to make us think that we haven't experienced it. And they also hold us back from telling our story to those that we may feel safe with or trust. And as she mentioned in her poem, on the other side of all of that is light, is love, is hope, but it's work, right? And so when we're supporting children, adults, youth in the community that have experienced trauma, how we can begin to get at the heart of a lot of this, allowing them to find their path, whatever that may be, is empathetic listening and validation, and not sympathy. Sympathy is a funny thing, right? It's a tricky thing. I personally have never really been a fan of sympathy. I find it in many ways and at times to be disingenuous. And I believe that probably started when my dad passed away, and the things that people say to you at funerals, and maybe you're thinking about your own experiences right now, is like, you know, coming up to you, and that all goes back to this sort of like, I want to comfort you culture, and I want to save you culture of, oh, well, they're in a better place. And I'm like, no, he's not in a better place. And I'm not, faith aside, right? I'm not talking about spirituality. I knew what they were getting at, but how it was translating to me in that moment was that my dad would have preferred to be here. He would have wanted to be with his grandchildren. He would have wanted to be here. And so that is what I'm talking about when I'm discussing like sort of sympathy versus empathy. Empathy is sitting with someone in their experience and saying, like, I'm sending you a lot of light and love right now. I know you're going through a difficult time. And sympathy often comes bundled in, well, you know, trying to like reason with why the situation that person is in is okay or normal or will pass. And we're all guilty of it. I default to sympathy sometimes when I can't show up and be authentic and be empathetic, when I'm just completely tapped out. But I always don't feel so wonderful afterwards. So how do you, if all of us are different, right? And as I mentioned, this is a journey. And how do you begin to conceptualize this in your professional practice, in your personal work, in your work in the community? And I believe it starts with yourself, knowing what your triggers are. You know, I am the CEO of an organization that has one of the largest crisis centers for survivors and their children who've experienced domestic and sexual violence in New Hampshire. And in the beginning, I served on the crisis line. There are times, because of my work, people will reach out to me and ask me for support. And my staff, as loving and awesome as they are, always kind of say to me, like, Jessica, like, you're not allowed to take certain calls anymore, because I know my trigger is these situations, and I will fly into like advocacy mode and rescue mode, and somehow empathy like takes a complete backseat. And it also can sometimes, if I'm not careful, you know, trigger me in those ways. And I think that's an exercise in patience that all of our advocates have to do every single day. But I also can see this extending, and I've seen it extend into classrooms and community programs. It's like, know what your triggers are, know where those things lie that may place you in judgment of someone, or on the other complete opposite end of that, place you in, I need to rescue this person. also like awarenesses of the messages you accept. You know, don't, this is one thing that I'm actually working on right now, is I do have a few people in my life that just kind of, I like to call it, I emotionally dump. I won't say the other thing, and I just did, because I figured maybe some of you are eating dinner, it's about that time. But be aware of the messages you receive, you know, and that gets back to that boundaries piece, you know, don't own the story. It's not your story. You can still hear the story and be empathetic to the story, but not own it and make it your own. And that can be particularly challenging with folks that are close to us, particularly our children, loved ones, partners. And share your story with those who deserve to hear it. When I first started sharing my story, I was just like gonna go all in. I was giving keynotes, which is like a speech that opens a conference statewide in New Hampshire for childcare teachers and professionals. And, you know, I was like, this was a wonderful way to be able to have a platform to talk about ACEs and to talk about my story and share my experience with others. But it was a mixed audience. And I'm not sure back then that I really gave people much of a preview into what they might have been in for listening to my story. So I don't think as much as that like they didn't deserve to hear it, it's like maybe like they weren't ready to hear it. Use the word shame and ask for what they need. You know, ask for what you need. Don't be afraid to do that. And that's not an easy skill to learn. However, shame kind of grows and festers on us not being very accepting and kind to ourselves. So how can you sharpen your story listening skills, right? Because, you know, it's not always easy to listen to stories, particularly for those of us that may have really challenging day-to-day jobs and are balancing a family and other things, right? And so I always say the easiest way to get through something is to start somewhere. And oftentimes what I know a lot of people will do is they'll take shortcuts to save themselves work on the back end. See this a lot. I saw this a lot in my practice in classrooms with consulting on for children, is, you know, a lot of dismissing and denying, you know. And so validation isn't you endorsing something and saying this is amazing. Validation is you are recognizing that other person as a human being and their experience in the moment and saying, I'm sure this is difficult for you right now, or some variation of there. So first you need to cultivate empathy versus sympathy. Abandoning judgment, probably the most difficult of them all, because judgment is how we navigate our environment. It's how we get through. It's a survival mechanism. We're wired to judge because we're supposed to be, you know, it's like survival of the fittest, right? The difference, which brings you to a higher level of humanity, is like knowing why you're judging. Why am I judging this person right now? Can I judge this person and still be empathetic? This is a big one I sometimes fall into, is I want to avoid disappointment. So I either, you know, will listen to a story I'm not really ready to receive, or I will, you know, leave out parts of a story that I might be sharing because I know that my audience, I don't want to disappoint them, because if disappointment is another emotion that I have to navigate through, and us trauma survivors, generally speaking, do not like to disappoint other people, because disappointment has always been like a big flashing red warning sign. Because especially for me, because disappointment was always followed by some significant occurrence that would add to the pain I was feeling in the moment. Also, like, avoid finding someone to blame. We have a big blame culture. Like, we love to, like, everything has to have a reason. Everything has to have like, well, this happened because this happened. And that's just really not the way life works in general, I found in my 44 years on the planet. I find that, you know, oftentimes there is not one singular person to blame. And I am speaking in general terms now, because I do feel that obviously there are situations where there is someone very clearly to blame. But if you're using this as a mechanism to like kind of in your toolbox of listening to people, particularly it doesn't really help anything, because unknowingly what you've done is just sort of like shifted away the focus of that experience that person is sharing with you to someone else. Well, you're experiencing this because of them. And that goes back to us wanting to like rescue the person, the situation. Other one I see a lot is minimizing and avoiding. We talked about that. Comparing and competing, you know, like kind of like one-upping. Well, if I can share my experience, and I'm definitely guilty of this, if I can share my experience, then, you know, then that'll make them feel better because someone else has gone through that too. I've noticed that I do that a lot when I'm trying to make someone feel better, because I want them to know they're not alone. And what it can sometimes seem like unknowingly is like I'm dismissing them and I'm focusing it back on me. Avoiding upsetting people, right? We don't like to upset people. And you know, that I think that's very closely aligned with disappointment. And then the other one would be being a super problem solver, especially in our field of helping people. We love to be the rescuer in someone's story. It gives us a degree of gratification. It makes us feel good. But when someone's sharing their story with us, we don't need to problem solve for them. We need to listen for questions and prepare what we can for answers. And so we're not, it's like kind of moving from listening to respond to listening to empathize, to listening to validation. And that's not us agreeing with what that person is saying or doing or how they've responded, but it's sharing space with them where they are at in that moment. So we're going to listen to another poem. This is one of my favorites that I've seen so far.
We all have a number story.
I'm from backseat bedtimes, gas station showers, the smell of uncertainty, a burden on my senses, 3 schools, 1 year. Wet dew on the grass lets me know it's time for school. I'm from late night cuddles with the family to beat the force of the piercing night wind. I'm from trauma, from I get it from my mama, feeling expanding guilt for wanting a better life than my mama. She did her best, now I do the rest. I'm from breaking down barriers. Why are there barriers anyway? White people who never went to college tell me I have to go to college to be somebody because Black girls work harder. Black girl, be smarter. Average doesn't make it. You have to be amazing. Don't ever be an angry Black girl. I'm from crying the first time I saw a sea. From fear, never shown, always felt inside. Don't show them what's inside. A little girl who never got a chance to live. I'm from rain clouds hit different in my neck of the woods. I'm from the hood where I never seen a rainbow or the silver lining. No crying, unstable, always fighting, mislabeled. Black girl, make magic from pain. Remember your name, handcrafted so you always have your family. Remember family. Remember the only thing that saved you was love and writing and the love of writing. Don't stop writing. I'm from unknown heritage I indulge in. My ancestors did heavy in my soul. They mastered the arts that run through my blood, healed wounds with laughter and love, and I am still learning. I am from the womb of a goddess.
Learn more about your story at numberstory.org.
So powerful. So how can we learn this practice of listening to our stories and sharing our stories? Let me see a chat. So want to open up some time for reflection. Yeah. Lotus Eater, I agree. Very powerful that one was. So what we've seen in these poems is these individuals being at a point where they can show up as their authentic self. And authenticity is difficult. It's a practice, much like exercise or your spiritualness. It's a practice. Being authentic is a lot of work. You're probably like, what? Authenticity? Being authentic is a lot of work. It's a lot of work. Because to be inauthentic is much easier at times because it allows you to do those shortcuts that we were discussing earlier. And there are times, and even Brené Brown talks about this in her book, The Gifts of Imperfection, where she will default to being inauthentic because she's too exhausted to be authentic. So I want you to know, and take it for what it's worth from me, that there may be times where it's hard to show up as your authentic self due to circumstances, the situation, or anything like that. Accepting your imperfections is the best way to begin to listen and tell stories in this manner and way. And we're all made of strength and struggle. All of us. You know, everyone has their own degree that they've been through. And so we also need to cultivate this idea that we are enough, right? Believing that we are enough. And so I would really, if any of you have, I'm sure most of you have heard of Brené Brown, but she is one of my favorites. I've spent a lot of time over the last few years reading her and researching her because of a lot of the work she does is really aligned with many of the things that I'm interested in. But, you know, that's a really great, she has some really great books. Another really good book that I've listened to some podcasts on, but I haven't really had a chance to do much of a deep dive into it. If you are interested in these kinds of resources, is What Happened to You by Dr. Bruce Perry and Oprah Winfrey. And so what they talk about is that as a culture, we often will ask, like, what's the matter with you, right? We'll say that, like, what's the matter with you? And what we really need to do is like adjust and shift our language a little bit to like, what happened to you? Because even as I talk about when I was consulting with children in classrooms and teachers, I used to share like behavior at that age, and these were little friends, like birth to 5, is a form of communication. And even my older children, I have 4 children, even my older children, even as they gotten older, behavior is still a form of communication. You know, being able to communicate what you're hurt about, what you're upset about, what you're sad about is an advanced skill. And as we've been talking about tonight, we have a culture that's kind of set up that allows you platforms to express yourself. But there are all of these sort of like barriers in place that make us think that we can't always show up the way we want to in those conversations and in those stories. So when you're practicing this, also think about go and get deliberate. Don't shrink yourself for others and share this phenomenon with other people. Don't make yourself, you know, smaller to fit other people, you know. Get inspired, listen to other people. I've had to do a lot of work on listening to others. As you can imagine, I'm pretty extroverted, although one-on-one, I'm probably more introverted if that's possible. And get going, prioritize authenticity, whatever that looks like for you. And it's not a race, it's a process. So let's look at our last story of the evening.
We all have a number story.
I'm caged behind the lyrical music called bars. Dicen que este lugar está lindo, but I'd rather stay up in the stars. Shoot the moon and hang with Mars. Peace, I'll be back in a second. I gotta make a crash landing on Earth to try to become a legend. And if that doesn't work, I have to load my pen with ammunition y cuento mis historias to whomever in life decides to listen. Life's a given, not sometimes, but most of the time, we take it for granted. Material objects overcome the wisdom of love, and I can't stand it. I'm surrounded by memories about thoughts, cops and lies, innocent truths, but I hide behind a number. So what's the reason I lied to you? I could never find the proof, hiding in the rubble of words, dispersed in a catchy verse, so everyone around me can learn. Life's a game, it's not your turn. Life's a flame, you gotta watch it burn. It's me, the mic, and the monster inside. My lyrical point of view is this day and the night, every day that we fight, everything we see in the news. The struggle for money, the need for relax, the trouble we get for putting up numbers, only to catch statistics. Defined by my aces, we are looking for an escape, busting on the spaceships. Past does not define you. El pasado no te define. The past does not define you. El pasado no te define. Y yo soy que hablando no es caro. Because we live in a life that's priceless. No wonder you haven't heard. Because I'm a genius working in silence. And I use my words, not violence. Some say to call me a loser, but little do they know I'm working on the future. The roses fall, I take the bow. Just life was simple now. Peace and war is what we're used to. Que descansa en paz, mi amigo guru. We knew what we had to learn. What we want, we have to earn. Burn the thoughts that feed off my rhymes. As the clock whispers, it's my time. As sound surrounds us, it covers us like blankets. Blankets of melodies and words that used to form a message. It's the billion other planets out there, and we happen to live on this one. It's the blood of memories that provokes me to be heard. Each and every single day is the words that I spray like a can on my train of thoughts. Our very own hands that have touched a lifetime of memories. Collapsing on the weight of the world, dropping knowledge like an atomic bomb on Earth. For what it's worth, cast spells of intelligence like a curse. And it works. These words and my rhymes are made in mind like a factory. I, myself, a piece of the soul. Some may say, a masterpiece.
Learn more about your story at numberstory.org.
So Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, she talks about how people are like stained glass windows. They sparkle and shine when the sun is out, but when the darkness sets in, their beauty is revealed only if there is light from within. And so finding that light within takes a long time, longer time sometimes. And so sometimes we just need to be patient and watch it. So I shared my references with you all if you wanted to check out The Gifts of Imperfection with Brene Brown or numberstory.org. I didn't anticipate us being early, but here we are. I don't know why my screen, there we go. I'll get you all back. So questions, thoughts, reflections. I know it was really heavy. So also feel free, I'll put my email in the chat. You can send me a note later if you'd like to get something off your chest. Dave's putting in the wrap up for the session, how you're going to get your certificate and all of those things. And we have 2 more sessions left, 5 and 6. Not this heavy, I promise. My last session was grief and loss. So it's like 2 back-to-back really thought-provoking ones. is that fantastic that you all are just so astounded. Welcome, Zainab. Yeah, lots to think about, Maria. All right, well, like I said, hopefully you can join us for the next 2 sessions. And so the next session will be in November and the last one will be in January. And I appreciate all the love in the chat, and hopefully having this extra 15 minutes or so is good for your evening. So thank you for spending some time with us tonight. Have a great night.